button. We'll address these breakout questions. The first of which being, what was your contemporary analysis for the reading? So who would like to share what they thought the contemporary analysis was for this text? Go ahead, Bovina.
This reading made me pretty upset, like the other one did, simply because of the fact that Africa is a continent. And I believe, not to sound uninformed, but I believe a continent is bigger than a country, the United States, for example. And it upset me that they only mentioned one region to talk about people that they probably didn't even know much about to describe them. And they also mentioned a region that it kind of sounded like a rainforest to me. And I feel like the fact that there was a region that was sort of like a rainforest kind of allowed them to deem Black people as being animalistic. It just kind of gave them more of an excuse to do so. And that just really upset me because it sounded very ignorant to me. It sounded like they were very uninformed and they were making assumptions based off of very little information.
Thank you, Bovina. Anyone else? Contemporary analysis for the text. Ulysses, what was discussed in your group?
Yeah, so we talked about a lot of different things. For one being the type of land that they discover, or I wouldn't say discovered, but like um there was people that wrote down like notes and stuff about about the land, and then how there was like massive um like there was rotting vegetables, um, um interwoven tree like vines, and then there was also like a lot of mosquitoes, crocodiles, hippos, and other um like unknown other unknown forms of life, of tropical life, and it just wasn't safe. But and then also talked we talked about how there was when there was like strange people, that's what they called them, but it was like later to be known as tribes, like different tribes over there. So yeah. So,
Okay. So based off what Bovina points us to, based off what Ulysses points us to, how does that relate to what's going on in our world today? Right. Like, so what I've heard from both of you are very spot on analysis. You're perfect in your analysis, but excuse me, but provide me the contemporary aspect of it, right? Like, how do these points impact what's going on in our world now? Russell, how, in your estimation, does what you read apply to what's going on in your world today?
It can apply to today's world because even in today's world, there's still like information they hide or like used to manipulate the news to like benefit themselves.
Absolutely, right? We're still seeing the colonization of information. We're still seeing information being manipulated to paint people in certain ways, right? That's a great contemporary analysis. What was the role of nature and the role of religion in the destruction of Black civilization? Go ahead, Bobina.
Okay, so the role of nature, I believe that the role of nature was to, as I said before, it just kind of gave more of an excuse to put people in a category of acting a certain way based off of one environment and the region that they lived in. And then the role of religion, I mean, the truth is, no one wants to, people are afraid of death. People are afraid of what comes after death. And people are also very afraid of the unknown when it comes to religion and spirituality. So when people mention religion, it can kind of cause people to want to listen to them more, considering the fact that people want to be saved. People don't want to fall into the hands of evil. People don't want to fall into the hands of something that's going to hurt them or their family. So, of course, they're going to be more willing to listen. So, religion probably aided in negative stigmas being spread.
You know, one thing that I think is interesting that you mentioned, well, you mentioned several interesting things, but one thing I was really attentive to, this notion of fear, right? People want to be saved. And for me, that begs the question, saved from what, right? And one way to think about that answer is hell, right? The invention, one more time, the invention of the concept of hell did a masterful job of producing the fear that was caused to convert African people from their standard spiritual practice to what we now know as Christianity, right? There's a beautiful quote from Shaka Zulu who says, you know, my people don't fear hell because we eat fire. So you coming to me with this little bullshit notion of hell and my body burns, but I come from a people who eat fire. So that doesn't fear me, right? Other thoughts on the role of religion or nature in the destruction of African civilization, or anything that stood out to you within the text? Go ahead, Anthony.
All right, so there's two things that actually stood out to me in the text, and what my group and I talked about actually was something that we didn't know about, which was Arab imperialism before European imperialism. I never knew that was a thing, and neither did my group mates. So that was actually surprising to hear about within the reading. And then another thing was also, I can't find where it says it, but somewhere in the first reading, it does say that the African population would have been 4 times as big as it is right now if it wasn't for the unfavorable conditions that they underwent.
Good call out. Thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead, Gloria.
A part that stood out to me was how they talked about how African Americans had to revert to cannibalism. I feel like that, like in itself, it obviously is like disgusting, but to say that because of all the hardships that they went through, that they had to revert to that as like one of the last options was like mind blowing to me. But I wasn't really surprised by it. But like leading to even now in society, like I do hear about it in the news, like there are still people out here that are like 100% for that. And I don't know, it was a lot to take in, given that there's like, I know their lack of resources played the part, but I feel like it's just unfair. Like I was like, it made me mad because it's like, there's so much land and all this that you guys could have given them something, just like water, like anything, but you had them literally like eating each other. Like that's what's crazy. I don't know.
Yeah, and you know what? You brought up a really interesting point that I didn't think about till right now, as it pertains to this cannibalism thing. No one trips off of the European Dark Ages and their practice of cannibalism that's not talked about in a negative way, right? Do you one further? So in both of those circumstances, European Dark Ages that produced the cannibalism and the cannibalism that African people had to engage in, those were due to lack of resources, right? Even talking about the Europeans, I'm not gonna like out them just because they're Europeans. The conditions were the same, right? But here's where it gets fucked up and get kind of weird. Anybody watch Atlanta? The show Atlanta? Nah. Donald Glover? Nah. Okay. Well, put that aside. There's this thing, we'll call it, where wealthy people are eating people. They're engaging in the space of cannibalism from like this like elitist type of posh thing to do, right? And no one's pointing at them and looking at them as savages. This has now become posh. It's become sophisticated. It's become, right? So it's just a very interesting twist that you kind of pointed me to, that even if the circumstances don't dictate that you must engage in this act, depending on your complexion, it's acceptable. Shit, wow. Anyone else want to share some things that may have stood out to them? All right. So we'll get into the text. This is the book that the chapter was pulled from. It's titled The Destruction of Black Civilization. It's what's called a seminal text. So like a foundational text in Africana studies, especially when you're considering the role of history, right? And I think this is a very comprehensive text, and it's probably one of the first one that we pointed to within the canon of Africana studies as it pertains to understanding how we got to the state that we're at, right? From historical contextualization. Looking at the first page, last paragraph on the bottom, it states that it was pointed out that the study of Blacks must begin in Egypt because most of their indestructible monuments are there. And further, because many of the artifacts archaeologists have been uncovering during the past 75 years as Egyptian are in fact African. Yet, the very heartland of the race and the cradle of civilization were actually further south below the first cataract, centered around the capital cities of Napata and Meroe. From there, Black civilization spread north, reaching its most spectacular achievement in what became known as Egyptian civilization. So I want to do kind of two things here, right? I want to kind of take you back to Monday's conversation and what I mentioned around being able to cross-reference to check information out, right? Y'all remember how I had a conversation about being able to cross-reference, pulling different books to see if the information lines up, right? I want to demonstrate how we can begin to cross-reference. Think back to, I believe it was week 2 when we read the teachings of Ptahhotep. And in that text, they talk about the Metu Neter, right? The hieroglyphics. And it states in the text that there is no evidence of a developmental period for the hieroglyphics, right? They become on the scene fully produced and fully put together, right? So let me ask you all this and think about it. If you're going to research or try to uncover the origins of the Metu Neter or the hieroglyphics, what location would you go to? Where would you go? You seek to research the hieroglyphics, what area would you go to do that research?
Egypt.
Thank you, Vicky. You would go to Egypt. You would think, right? But again, they're telling you in Egypt, there is no record of the hieroglyphics being developed, right? So check it out. Yet the very heartland of the race and the cradle of the civilization were actually further south, below the first cataracts, centered around the capital cities of Napata and Meroe. From there, so from Napata and Meroe, south of Egypt, right? From there, Black civilization spread north, reaching its most spectacular achievement in what became known as Egyptian civilization. So by cross-referencing, right, this book is pointing us to the reality that, okay, it makes sense why the hieroglyphics don't have a developmental period if you look in Egypt. Because from what this book is telling us, Egypt's origins come from the south, come from Meroe and Napata. So possibly, quite possibly, if you were to look and do research in Meroe and Napata, you may find that developmental period of the hieroglyphics, right? Because he's telling you that this civilization that we know as Egypt or Kemet stems from a civilization that started before that, that was south of Egypt or Kemet, right? Known as Monroe or Nempata. So you see how being able to cross-reference several texts allows you to glean deeper insights to the arguments that are being made within the text. These two texts are in conversation with one another if you know how to engage that in a particular way. Does this make sense? So I'm going to move to page 45, but I want to kind of provide the context, right? It talks about how, Asian and Arabic and European invasion and the slave system that was produced through those invasions caused African people to migrate and flee, right? And when they flee, they split up and splintered, right? So there's 14 people in the class right now, right? If we are to put ourselves in their situation, and if 14 of us are on the run from enslavement, how wise would it be for all 14 of us to run together? It may be more prudent to split up, right? Take 4 of us, you go this way, take 4 of us, you go this way, right? And we separate. This will have us a better chance of sustaining and living, right? So this is what's happening to set the context for what I'm going to read. But before I get into what I'm going to read, I want you again to think about Monday's discussion, right? This idea of stereotypes and this idea of myths, right? One of those stereotypes and one of those myths is the notion that African people in Africa is primitive, correct? So one of the ways that they signify this primitive state of African people is saying, oh, well, they live in huts. Right? Even today, if you are to look at images of Africa, they won't show you the magnificently kept cities of Addis Ababa, of Nairobi, Kenya, of Accra, Ghana, right? Like, just to be honest with you, the way that those cities are maintained, the United States ain't got shit on that. Like, there's no homelessness there. You don't see trash and all that shit on the ground. That's not how they get down over there. Yeah, but Belvina, look it up. If you don't believe me, please do. These cities are kept immaculately. I went to Ghana, saw no homelessness, none, right? But one of the ways they trick you into thinking that they're primitive is these people live in huts. But check it out. A crucial question, let me go back a little bit further. Wherever the splintered off refugee groups found a place where the soil seemed favorable for cultivation and the land unoccupied by preceding migrants, they settled and began to build villages again. A sense of relative security was a necessary factor in deciding where to begin a new settlement. A crucial question was how many miles had they put between the slave hunters and themselves? For the kind of houses and community buildings they would erect depended directly on the probability of permanent settlement or sudden flight. In short, they could build large, sturdy, and attractive compound houses and temples of worship, or easily demolished huts. So again, give me back to the example, right? It's 14 of us. We break up into groups because we're on the run, right? We find some space that the soil is kind of cool to settle, right? And we think that we set up enough distance between ourselves and those who are hunting us, right? So now we're going to think about how are we going to start to build our city. Now, if you're on the run, would it make sense to build a big ass house with a big ass temple for worship? Nah, because if they come, then what? You got to break that shit down and get gone, right? What makes sense is a little hut that you could break down quickly and be out. So what they did when they seen these huts is say, oh, look how primitive these people are. But it's not about being primitive. Really, it's about a supreme level of intelligence. Because he's telling you they had the capacity to build these large compound houses or small huts. What they did determine was based on the situation. So if we can settle for a long time and we're going to be here for a while and no one's going to invade us, then yeah, we'll build these big ass houses and castles because that's how we get down. But if we don't think we got enough distance and we think they're gonna run up on us, we're gonna be ready to escape. So to me, that doesn't show a lack of civility or a lack of technological advancement. What it shows is supreme intelligence in knowing how to adapt to your situation. Why do something that's gonna get you caught? But you see how they can manipulate the historical context to make you think that these people are primitive, right? Looking at the next page, and here he goes into the results of the fragmentation and the isolation, right? I'm looking at the second paragraph on page 46. Fragmentation and isolation had two monumentous consequences. The first, that was the isolation of various groups, led to the development of over 2,000 different dialects and languages. The second fateful outcome was that the rise of all of these tongues widened the gulf between the Blacks that territorial distance had already achieved. So let's put that into context, right? Again, it's the 14 of us. We have to separate, right? Originally, when we were one group, we all spoke one language. But as time and distance goes on, those dialects begin to change. Now, we don't have to think too abstractly about this. Like, let's just think about the United States, right? Do someone from like somewhere, let's say New Orleans, right? They have a different English dialect than someone from California, correct? Okay, so we don't even go outside of the state of California, especially for Black folks, right? Do a Black person from Oakland sounds vastly different from a Black person from Southern California, yes or no, right? So you understand how what they mean when they're saying these different dialects, okay? Spanish, there's various ways to speak Spanish depending on your location, right? How one speaks Spanish in El Salvador might be vastly different from how one speaks Spanish in Mexico, right? So this is what they mean when they say these dialects. So what happens is, as we go from 14 to these smaller groups, we're producing different dialects, but they're all derived from the same language, right? And so much splintering happens, in fact, that we produce over 2,000 different dialects and languages. Africa has the most languages of any continent. This is a byproduct of this migration that he's pointing us to. So he says, not only does the language create a separation, because now we speak different languages, but we're also what? We're running in different areas. So space is getting greater and greater. So we have the two things that separate us is the distance because of our fleeing and the new languages that are developed due to our fleeing, right? So this is what he's pointing out as the consequences to this scattering, the consequences to this migration. We don't get into that. I don't want to do that either. Okay, so I think one of the things that becomes important, I think it's important to contextualize, because I definitely hear Belvina in the sense of this is an upsetting text. But there is a glimmer of inspiration, a glimmer of hope, and a nod to the futurity of African people within the text. Because I mean, if we think about it, right? These are individuals, we descend, for those African descended people in the room, right? We descend from individuals who had to fight nature, right? Had to fight off foreign invasion, had to fight off the disease and famine of trying to battle the desert, right? Had to fight off an enslavement campaign from not only Europe, but from Arabic descended folks as well, right? Then the onslaught of religious persecution. And this is just what happens while on the African continent. Not to mention the Middle Passage and the centuries of enslavement, then the Jim Crow era, then the Reconstruction era, then the Black Code era, right? Then the crack epidemic of the 80s, right? To something more recent in your time, the 2010 through 20 killing of constant Black bodies that produces the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So for people to go through all of that and still fucking be here is a miracle. To still be here and have a semblance of sanity left is a miracle. Because let's call it what it is. Let's call it what it is. For people who've gone through all of those things, it would be justifiable for them to be stark raving mad and extremely violent. It would be justifiable if African people were as violent as the power structure makes us out to be. It would be within our right. So this begs the question, how then were the Blacks able to battle invading enemies from one end of the continent to the other for several thousand years? True, they were overcome in the end. And I push back against that. I don't think we were overcome because we're still here. But anyway, but what sustained them through all those centuries of struggle on so many different fronts and against so many different kind of enemies? Weakened so generally by both disease and what became perpetual hunger, whence came their strength and courage to carry on? It may well be that the answers lie in the death-defying pyramids they built in Egypt when the land was theirs. So he's posing the question, like, how do these people do it? What is it that allows them to be still here and not going on like killing rampages and shit? Because again, justifiable. What is it? You may be able to find that answer in the pyramids. So if we think back to how we started our class in the lecture that I gave us, and I pointed out that, you know, the pyramids were built in alignment with the star system. And I point out to you that in the ancient Kemetic mystery schools, how you would advance through the mystery school were mastering spiritual principles, right? We know that what constructed the pyramids for African people were supreme spirituality and supreme thirst and desire for knowledge. So we can glean from that, that this is what sustains African people through all of these things. Our spirituality and our supreme desire to obtain knowledge. The book is titled The Destruction of Black Civilization, The Issues of Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD, right? So just to take that time frame from what the book is titled into consideration. So we've been enduring shit from 4500 BC to 2024. Y'all heard of the science of epigenetics? Anybody heard of this term, epigenetics? Epigenetics is the notion or the science of understanding how trauma gets imprinted into your DNA and it gets passed down from generation to generation to generation, right? So as a man, the trauma that I experienced in my upbringing, in my childhood, in my life, right? It gets encoded into my DNA. As men, we carry our children with us, right? So as we experience these traumas, they're also being impressed upon our children. As women, the trauma that you go through throughout your lifetime, when you're carrying that baby for those 9 months, that trauma is being impressed in that baby's DNA. So that trauma gets passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. So again, 4500 BC to 2024 of constant trauma, 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 with no space for healing, with no space for healing, with no space for healing. How are we still here? How do you get up in the morning and continue to push on? That is miraculous. That's the beauty in this reading. That's the focal point. That's the takeaway. There's something in us that allows us to keep going. And my estimation is whatever that thing is, you can't put your finger on. It exists in what's called the immaterial world, in the world of spirit. This is why we start our class with meditation, to allow you to tap into that thing that's in you, that's the spirit, because that's what's going to allow you to continue on, to push through. Want to leave time for fishbowl. You could talk about my lecture. You could talk about the breakout discussions. You could read from your journals. All that's on the table. We'll get 3 people. You have to do 2 fishbowls per semester. You have 1 time to pass. Does anyone want to volunteer? And if not, I'll just call that random. All right. Okay, I'm sorry. Glorian, you have 1. Hugh, you have 2. 1 more. Vanessa, are you prepared to fishbowl? Vanessa, are you prepared to fishbowl? Pablo, are you prepared to fishbowl?
Yeah.
So we'll go with Glorian, Hugh, and Pablo. Glorian, can you start us off, please?
Yeah, okay. Basically in my journal, my main 2 was one, like the cannibalism thing that I talked about. And then the second one was, I feel like one of my classmates mentioned it as well, about how the population was reduced by 3/4. To me, like, that's such a huge number, and how only like 1/4 was able to survive the conditions. Like, that's such a small amount compared to like what it could have been. And I feel like there's so many people that did not get to really experience life itself, given like lack of conditions, just lack of resources, like overall just being like viewed as not human and like monstrous in like the previous reading that we had. So like honestly, overall the reading like made me really upset and hurt by it, because I feel like it's not talked about enough how like, at least for African Americans like myself, it's like there's such a small amount of us that it's like we could have been given so many other opportunities, or like the people that weren't able to like outlive their life, like could have experienced so many things that they didn't even get the opportunity to, because of people deciding their fate, which makes me upset, because it's like, why is it your choice to dictate what someone can do and what they can't do? Honestly, because of like skin color, like that's just ridiculous to really think about. And it's like, it's still not like gone, like it's still present in today's society. Like people are still viewed in certain lights and held to certain standards compared to everyone else, and it's just unfair overall. Like it was like more, it made me mad, of course, but also like I was more like upset and hurt by it because of all the people that didn't really get to experience like what I am now doing with myself. So I don't know. There's a lot more to it, obviously, but I feel like the main points, those really stood out to me, just like the whole cannibalism thing, like them having to revert to like the lowest of lowest options in order to survive. And even then not really make it that far because of like slavery or just like climate and like everything else. So yeah, I just feel like overall, like it's a lot deeper than what is talked about. And I feel like there could be more conversations that surround these topics that should be just common conversations between people, even in today. Like it shouldn't be something where it's like frowned upon or people are scared to speak about, because realistically, like without those people who sacrificed themselves, like we wouldn't have been where we are right now. So honestly, it's kind of like a thank you to them, but at the same time, it's like, damn, like y'all should have been here with us as well. So
And that doesn't include, Gloria, like the folks who we lost during enslavement, right?
Yeah.
Like those are just in the process of trying to migrate out of Kemet, right? So you have a whole other millions of people who were lost during enslavement. So that's a really good call out. And I also would comment, like, I think we feel so like such a small group because we're in Southern California. Like
Yeah,
out here is not a lot of us.
that's true.
If we had been like in the back east, somewhere down south, we wouldn't feel so isolated. But this is kind of where we're at. Thank you. Hugh.
So the thing that stood out for me the most in the reading was how like the invaders or colonizers used religion and warfare to exploit and conquer African civilizations. Like both Islam and Christianity were used to convert Africans, which forced them like to adopt Western values, which ended up causing the erasure of their African cultural identity and the continuation of them like the self-hatred within like the Black communities. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, you know, that's a really good call. I know I want to save space, excuse me, for Pablo, but I think he points us to a very, very, very important part, right? The influx of Christianity and the influx of Islam is what produces the space for enslavement to kind of take root, right? Because if we think about what we read in the terms of the teachers of Ptahhotep, we want to eliminate strife. It's about the good of the collective, right? You're going to move from a space that's ma'at. You're going to be concerned about the care of the other person. Once you get those values to be eroded, and you start to introduce things like individualism, then you'll be more comfortable with trading your brother, and that's not really how it works. I'm just saying this colloquially, right? Trading your brother into a system of enslavement, right? And really, I say that's not how it works because what happens is if we have a war, right, and you lose the war and I take you as prisoner, those would be the people who are determined to be enslaved, right? So I'm going to trade you off for riches, not knowing that I'm trading you off to this vicious system of enslavement that we know of. The Africans who were doing the trading of other Africans had no concept of what was being done to their brothers and sisters. Does this make sense? But what Hugh was pointing us to was the fact that what had to happen first was the erasure of African values. And it was the religious impetus that allowed for that erasure. Good point. Thank you. Pablo?
Yeah, something I found really interesting was the way that back then they made Africans. I'm sorry, this is talking about that they assumed African people were automatically like primitive because of the huts that they built instead of building like large civilizations or large buildings where they could live in, since they knew that like the huts would be better in their case, since they knew that the slave traders would come in and try to take them whenever they could. And also the idea that people had to split up into groups, since it would be easier to like maybe get away if they were all like in each like individual, like let's say 2 or 4 groups instead of like groups of like 16, since then they would like catch all of them at once. And something else I found interesting was the way that in some religions the slave masters would have the slaves change their names to Christian names, and in some cases they would also like force them to take their own names, like the slave masters' names. They would name their slaves those names to just like help keep that name intact. Well,
Good call out, Pablo. Thank you. So one thing I want to pick up on that Pablo points us to, I want to make sure that's very, very clearly understood. Beasley, Hopkins, Lett, McLean, is that how you pronounce that? McLean? And Gaskins, right? Why this becomes significant. So for Ulysses, Beasley is the last name of the man who owned the plantation that his family worked on. For Belvina, Hopkins, I got you, bro. Hopkins is the last name of the man, and understand my emphasis on man, because it's always a man, right? Of the man who owned the plantation that Belvina's family worked on. Let is the last name of the man who owned the plantation that Victory's family worked on. McLean is the last name of the plantation owner, the man who owned the plantation whose Mashara's family worked on. Gaskins is the last name of the man who owned the plantation that Glorian's family worked on. So this, for African people in America, is how we got our last name. And this is what Pablo is pointing us to. Ulysses, you're gonna say something?
No, yeah, real quick, I was just gonna say that like that is true because my grandma actually like because her and her husband had to go with my grandfather. He had like he went to the military to get out of the plantation and stuff. But they were telling me the story one time about how like their ancestors before them they were slaves, and then what's it called, their owner actually like helped them set them free, and so they took his last name, which was Beasley.
Yes, and that's a great story for the owner to look good because he set them free. But
Yeah.
that they would have had those names whether he set them free or not. That's the truth of the matter, right? And so when I talk about the notion of epigenetics of trauma being passed down from one generation to the next, how is that different from passing down the name of your oppressor from one generation to the next? So for me, I play sports. I play football, right? From I was 7 to about like 20 something, right? If you know the culture of football, they rarely ever call your first name. You're referred to as your last name consistently. So for me, growing up, all I heard was Davies, Davies, Davies. You make a play, you do something good, Davies on the tackle. Interception by Davies, right? So every time I was championed, whose name was being called off was my oppressor. I'm 40. I've been researching this shit, African thought, for over 20 years. As I went into archives, as I went into textbooks, as I researched journals, this name Davies consistently came up. Always the captain of the slave ship. His job was to engage in the trafficking of my people. So what sense would it make for me to give my son and my daughter the name of those who oppress me? Hence, Manzili. Got rid of that shit. This is my attempts to break generational curses, to remove generational trauma. The vestiges of enslavement, there's 3. Your name, which we've already discussed, your language, your religion. As African descended people, we were not speaking English before we got kidnapped and brought here. We had our own language. As African descended people, we were not Christian, we were not Muslim before we were kidnapped and put into enslavement. We had our own religions. I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Muslim. I practice the Akan spiritual tradition, which is an old, ancient African tradition. My attempts to remove these generational curses. Haven't got the language down yet, I'm working on it. But this is how I'm trying to remove myself from these generational curses. Do you one better, especially for you Christian ones? My mom and my pops believe in the idea that you spare the rod, spoil the child. Spare the rod, spoil the child. This is a biblical reference. So in other words, if you don't whoop your child will be spoiled. Spare the rod, spoil the child. So I grew up in a household of ass whoopings, right? Part of those ass whooping culture was to say things like, go outside and pick a switch. Where do you think that stems from? Go outside, get a switch so I could whoop you. The Bible, spare the rod, spoil the child. Spare the rod, spoil the slave. Go get that switch so I could whoop you. So you see, even in our parents, I'm speaking personally, our parents' best interest to raise you right is informed by these generational curses that we don't recognize. So do you think I would my kids? Fuck no. Why would I continue to perpetuate something that's harmful? Mashar, what you thinking?
When you had said like our last names came from people that had owned our families previously, I was thinking about it, and like I previously had searched up my last name a while back, and like what popped up was a slave owner, and I was like, oh, and I was just like, so I mean, kind of sad because we're stuck with the names, but
You're not stuck with anything, but it does produce a profound identity. And I don't know, to me, Amiri Manzili sound much cooler than Josh Davies. I think it's more suitable. So I just say that to say you're not stuck with shit. It's some paperwork, a little bit of money, but if you're so inclined, it can be done. Any other last minute questions, comments, or concerns? Go ahead, Bobina.
I was also caught off guard by that too. I did look my last name up too, and it was like some European, I forgot like which, I think it was Irish. I also did the whole ancestry thing. Um, so when you mentioned, I think you mentioned Malay, Malay, I don't know if I'm saying it right. I also have Malay roots, it's one of them. And I also looked into like the languages that certain some of the regions would speak. And there was even like languages like French or yeah, there was languages like French, and there was practices like I believe it was Yoruba.
Yep.
And what else was I gonna say? Oh, and I also agree heavily with the fact that, you know, I also grew up in like a Black family, and the very like the premise of if you hit your kids, they're gonna listen to you, like that's very evident. And I've even seen on like social media parents be like, you guys are soft, for wanting to speak to their kid or wanting to go to therapy or like wanting to do things for their mental health. They've been called soft for it. And I just find it insane that history has messed up Black culture so bad to the point where even music we're deemed as being quote unquote ghetto, and almost like how it was described in the Curse of Ham, described as being people who just want to steal things and take things and engage in fornication and just didn't really think logically. Whereas when you look at the history, it's like, wait, no, they were very logical individuals. So I just find all of that really crazy.
It's a lot, but to know it and to contextualize it helps. I know it's like it's jarring now, but sit and massage it out and think logically about it. It provides you a space for the out. Enjoy your weekend. I will see you all on Monday. For Monday's class, we are reading They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. The Mandingo Traders in Mexico is the chapter that we're reading. So again, They Came Before Columbus is about the African presence in the Americas prior to Christopher Columbus, right? And how African people and indigenous people came together to make culture. So we'll talk about that on Monday. Y'all have a good rest of your weekend. I will see you then. Peace.